All right, thank you everyone for joining. We're just going to get started in just another minute here, letting folks go ahead and log in. All right, I know that we have a full session today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. First off, welcome to UC Center Sacramento's Undergraduate Research Showcase. We are so proud of the amazing work our students have accomplished this term, especially in unprecedented times that we're in. And so thankful to all of our wonderful internship host sites and supervisors. So the format today will be that each student will present. After the student presents, we will take one question from their internship host site. If there isn't a question from their internship host site, then we will turn the question over to our academic team. We will have an open Q&A at the end of the session as time permits. All right, and with that, we're going to start with our first student, who is Kyle Tristan Poonsall, who interned with the California Fair Political Practices Commission, or FPPC, this term.
Hi, so my name is Kyle Poonsall, and I researched on the impact of universal background checks on firearm-related deaths with a recent shooting in San Jose that killed 9 people. Ensuring the effectiveness of universal background check policies are important now more than ever. I researched the effect of universal background check policies on firearm-related homicide and suicide rates. A previous study from 2018 by Wintermute et al. Indicates that the 1991 California background check law had no impact on firearm-related deaths. They discussed, although, that their conclusion may have been due to incomplete data gathered in the 1990s. So knowing this flaw, I hypothesized that background check policies do indeed decrease firearm-related homicide and suicide rates. I will instead be looking at the more reliable data of other states who recently passed their universal background check laws. With the data I gathered from the CDC, I made a time series and comparative case study of the effect of background checks on states that passed the same law, such as Delaware, Colorado, and Washington. With this data set, I am able to look at the non-firearm and firearm-related suicide and homicide rates of each state, with a rate per 100,000 individuals. My findings indicate that universal background checks did not cause a bigger net difference between firearm-related deaths and non-firearm-related deaths. And in fact, average firearm death rates increased 5 years post-implementation relative to pre-implementation of the policy. I suggest California legislative action to implement higher penalties, such as classifying repeated violations as felony to effectively decrease non-compliance among firearm buyers and sellers. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kyle. And then we'll go over for just a question for Kyle. So from his internship host site, if anyone from FPPC would like to go ahead and ask a question. If not, we will go over to our academic team. And if you can go ahead and raise your hand, I can go ahead and call on you and allow you to unmute. All right, and so a question from our academic team, if you can go ahead and raise your hand. All right, Professor Butters.
Kyle, nice job here. I really like this project a lot. We've talked about it a bunch of times, so I'm excited to see it finally up on the big screen here. So I was curious what you maybe thought was the explanation for, especially for Delaware and California, where over the last or your period of study here, they actually had a lot of less non-firearm related homicides. What do you think was the effective policy that led to that big drop of 18% in California and 8% in Delaware? Because Delaware's figure here in your figure 3 is actually quite drastic, I think, and pretty interesting.
Yeah, so maybe, so I did a bit of research, and so there may have been a decrease on non-firearm homicide and suicide rates because of public campaigns, especially for Delaware. A few years before 2013, there were a series of mass shootings, and this caused legislative action to really focus on ensuring that homicide and suicide rates decreased. I am not quite so sure why firearm homicide and suicide rates did not increase, but that may be a reason why.
Fantastic, thank you. And just to note, I think your figure 2 shows some great success for this policy in Colorado as well. But great job, Kyle, and thanks for your response.
All right, thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Professor Butters. And so our next student to present is Melissa Rivera, and she interned this term with the Local Government Commission.
Hi everyone, my name is Melissa, and my project is on the removal of the SAT and ACT requirements and if it increased diversity at universities. So the student body at UC institutions do not represent California's diverse population. The SAT and ACT has long been researched as a barrier for students of color from underserved communities from applying and enrolling at these universities. The removal of the SAT and ACT requirement for fall 2020 allows me to analyze if the removal of standardized testing increased UC application and enrollment numbers in California public high schools with a predominant population of students of color. My hypothesis is that the removal of the SAT and ACT requirement for UCs will increase both application and enrollment numbers for Latino students who attended a California public high school. My research design is gathered from quantitative data from the Education Partnership to compare the demographics of my selected sample of 6 public high schools with a total average of 3,489 students per school. I also gathered quantitative data from the UC database of admissions by school source, where I'm individually comparing each of my sample schools' application and enrollment numbers for fall 2018, 19, and 2020. As you can see on figure 4, my overall findings show that 4 out of the 6 high schools in my sample size have a predominant population of Latino students, but only 3 of the high schools had a slight increase in enrollment and application numbers for fall 2020 compared to the previous years. Enrollment and application numbers also increased the most significantly in fall 2020 for the high school with a predominant Asian population, while the high school with the leading white student population remained steady throughout the years. To increase diversity at UC institutions, I would suggest developing an alternative test that tests students on what they're currently learning on at school, rather than material they have to pay to learn. I would also suggest developing college readiness courses for underserved California public high schools to encourage and help prepare more students of color to apply at UC institutions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Melissa. And if there is a question from the Local Government Commission, you can go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, all right. Grace Person.
Hi. Hi, Melissa. My question is, do you think that the SAT, ACT requirement removal and increasing university diversity of enrollment will actually support diversity of hiring practices in the near future? So I guess what I'm asking is, do you hypothesize that because this removal only happened in the past year, this may, how long do you think it will take to see effect at the university level and in future employment demographics?
Hi, Grace. Thank you for the great question. Actually, so the UC institution decided that they're going to remove the SAT and ACT standardized testing until 2024. So I think that gives them time to analyze whether enrollment and application rates do increase even more for students of color. And if it does end up increasing like it did increase like this first year with its removal, I believe that I hypothesize that it'll keep increasing throughout the years it's removed throughout 2024. And I think that would actually really benefit the work population and increasing diversity as well, because more students of color can actually get out and get that UC education and receive that degree, that high prestigious degree.
Great, thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you so much, Grace. Appreciate the question. All right, so our next student is Reina Banuelos, and she interned this term with the Advancement Project.
Good morning, everyone. All right. Great. So my name is Reina Banuelos. Suspension and expulsion are disciplinary practices in public high schools that have an abundance of negative impacts on students. They can be linked to negative school outcomes, such as lower test scores and higher dropout rates, while regular school attendance is a predictor of academic success. Further, the UCLA Civil Rights Project finds that there are racial disparities in the policies and practices of expulsion and suspension. The existence of a race-based disciplinary gap begs the question of whether or not an income-based disciplinary gap or something of a similar nature exists as well. I hypothesized two things: that students who are identified as socioeconomically disadvantaged are expelled at a higher rate than their peers, and secondly, that they are suspended at a higher rate than their peers. Students are considered socioeconomically disadvantaged if they are eligible for free or reduced lunch in California, and or both of their parents do not have a high school diploma. My research design consists of data from the Education Data Partnership. I have conducted a small study consisting of the data of public high schools in 3 California counties: Shasta, Butte, and Sutter County, each county having similar demographics. From there, I compared the rate of suspension and expulsion of socioeconomically disadvantaged students to that of their peers during the school year of 2018 to 2019. My research found that socioeconomically disadvantaged high schoolers were not only suspended at a higher rate, but expelled at a higher rate as well. Socioeconomically disadvantaged students were nearly twice as likely to be suspended than their peers at a rate of 7.9% versus 4.4%, respectively. As for the rate of expulsion, socioeconomically disadvantaged high schools were expelled at the rate of 1.17% compared to 0.1% for their peers. My policy implications include that California legislature should work towards mandating suspension and expulsion as the last means of disciplinary action when all the resources have been exhausted, while also providing greater funds to public high schools that are allocated towards mental health clinicians and other resources to better serve students. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Raina. And if there's a question from her internship hostmate, if not, we'll go to the academic team. All right, a question from the academic team. All right, Professor Pantoja.
Hi, Raina. Great job on your presentation. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about your case selection. So like why Sutter, Butte, and Shasta counties, and do you think you'd find similar results across the state?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because in the beginning, I'd only included Sutter and Shasta County, and I'm from Sutter County, so I wanted to see the results there. And I had included Los Angeles County, but I wanted to compare all of the counties, and the demographics of LA aren't very similar to that of 2 rural counties, so I switched it to Butte. But from what I was finding in Los Angeles, it was a little bit similar, although I don't have any further results because I didn't continue that research. But yeah, I decided on these 3 rural counties because I figured they were much more comparable than if you were to include LA.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Pinto, for the question. Thank you so much, Raina, for your presentation. And so our next student is Esmeralda Bergen.
Hi everyone, my name is Esmeralda Barragan, and my project is called Are Crime Rates and Student Suspension Rates Related? School suspension is a systemic issue that has been recognized by the Departments of Education and Justice to racially discriminate against students of color. In particular, the 2012 to 13 academic year in California saw 700,000 students suspended. The number of students suspended at that time was 300,000 students more than the number of students that graduated high school that same year. As I considered different factors that may influence young people's behavior, I set to answer the following questions. Are crime rates and student suspension rates related? I hypothesized that counties with high crime rates will also have high suspension rates since young people's behavior or life outcomes can be influenced by their environments. For this study, I used the 2019 school suspension and crime rates defined here as property and violent crime for all of California counties. Figure 2 and 3 show how different types of crimes correlate to the suspension rates. Figure 2 shows that property crime rate has a weak negative correlation with suspension rate. Figure 3 shows that violent crime rate has a weak positive correlation with suspension rates because the slope of the line is positive. Notice how both graphs show very weak correlation, so the data does not strongly indicate any relationships between the factors. The high rates of suspension is concerning. For future research, a long-term study on one specific county can provide data on the number of suspended students that eventually contribute to the crime rates of their county. Another potential study can be analyzing youth crime rates for every county in California. Based on those analyses, legislators can consider implementing positive reinforcement alternatives that help keep students in schools. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Esmeralda. And this term, Esmeralda intern with the Education Trust West. And if there was anyone from their office, great. So Manny Rodriguez.
Good morning, and thank you, Esmeralda. My question, I think, would be, if you had more time, how would you further expand on this work and look into more like education-aligned issues or policy changes that could kind of work with your presentation and the research you did?
Yeah, so if I had more time, something that I wanted to do was look at certain counties, and then with high suspension rates, and also with more students of color, and analyze the type of policies or memorandum of understandings that they have created alongside the police department that they sometimes cooperate with, and see how those policies and changes are reducing suspension rates. However, I also think that it's important to look at data over time to see how those suspension rates are either decreasing or not. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Manny, for the question, and thank you, Esmeralda, for the presentation today. And so our next student is Terence Chao, who interned with the Education Trust West this term.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Cindy. There's a common consensus among educators in California that throughout the coronavirus pandemic, enrollment rate in the K-12 education system has declined at the start of the 2021 school year when compared to previous school years. As summarized in the EdSource article, the pandemic is the likely driving force behind 3% overall decline of K-12 enrollment, the most drastic in the past decade. I believe that the coronavirus pandemic and its concurrent lockdowns throughout 2020 has contributed to the declining enrollment across counties in California, where the harder the pandemic has affected the county, the steeper the enrollment rate declines. I'll be obtaining annual K-12 enrollment data for the past 5 years and numbers of COVID-19 confirmed cases on both on the county level and compare them side to side to see if there's any correlation. I found that counties that have high caseloads, such as San Bernardino and Orange, have prominent drops in annual K-12 enrollment rate between 1920 and 2021 school year, whereas counties that have low caseloads, such as Mariposa and Trinity, do not have much of a change in enrollment rate within the same time period. It can be inferred that this is a small representation of trends among other counties in California, where wealthier, densely populated counties with high caseloads have more drastic decline when compared to rural counties. Policies such as pandemic relief funds and stimulus checks would alleviate families' fiscal stress, which would in turn lead to pupils returning to school. In addition, addressing the pandemic will certainly play a crucial role in the pace of public schools reopening, where the enrollment rate would increase once parents knew it would be safe for their children's return. Exploration of such causal relationship between the declining enrollment rate in the county and infection rate of county is significant in understanding how the coronavirus pandemic affects K-12 education, which can help future policy planning within the realms of education and beyond. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Terence. And so if there's a question, so Hannah Ma.
Work over the past few months and for this presentation. I'm curious whether you think, well, I mean, I guess my question is, what are some things that schools and districts can do to re-engage students, especially high school students, as they come back to school in the fall?
Hi, Hannah. Yeah, that's a great question. I believe that since everyone's so out of touch with they're just so weirded out by how online schooling has been affected them, both on teachers, parents, and students. One thing that schools can do to re-engage them is by having incentive for them to go back to school, and also implement safety measures in schools, since many public schools have overcrowding issues. So personally, I would feel like by implementing safety measures, even though the pandemic it's probably in a better state than a year ago, it would be on the parents' peace of mind if they were to have safety measures in school and having rotational scheduling and hybrid measures in terms of like online teaching and in-person schools. So just to safely going back in person. So that way, when all these measures are in place, parents would feel like a peace of mind for their kids to go back to school.
All right, thank you so much, Hannah, for the question. Thank you so much, Terence, for the presentation. And so our next student is Des Godinez, who interned this term with the California Department of Education Equity Office.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Cindy, for that introduction. Okay. On March 21st of 2021, a TikTok made by an intercollegiate student athlete named Sedona Prince went viral and receiving over 3.5 million likes in less than 24 hours. Her TikTok showed a day in the life of a March Madness basketball player for the Oregon Ducks women's basketball team, which included having to use subpar gym equipment in comparison to that of her male counterparts. The National Collegiate Athletics Association, or NCAA for short, issued a prompt, albeit disappointing response to the video, but public opinion and media continued to argue about how easy it is for colleges and universities to sweep inequity under the rug. This story inspired me to complete my research project on whether or not California public NCAA colleges and universities have more or less Title IX athletic-related inequities than private NCAA colleges and universities. My hypothesis is that public schools have more than private schools. My evidence comes from data that's been organized over the past 5 years by the Equity in Athletics Data Analysis. The independent variables in my research are Title IX law as applied to ICA and public-private status of all 57 schools. My dependent variables are inequities based on the allocation of funds towards student athletes, coaches, and teams sorted into 5 different categories. For categories 1, 2, 4, and 5, I qualified data as being inequitable when either the men's or women's respective teams or student athletes held a 55% or more share of allocated funding. For category 3, I qualified data as being inequitable when either the men's or women's head coaches received a salary that was $5,000 or more than the respective counterparts. My findings from figures 2 through 7 support my hypothesis, but unfortunately suggest that there are large percentages of both public and private schools with inequities. Up to 93% of public schools and 82% of private schools reported inequities in at least one category or of each the past 5 years. Additionally, there are more public schools and private schools with inequities in at least 3 categories over each of the past 5 years. Overall, there's a higher percentage of public schools with inequities in categories 1, 2, 3, and 5. To fix the issue of gender-based Title IX athletic-related inequity, I suggest increasing audits of all California NCAA colleges and universities, and I suggest establishing an equitable universal pay rate for all coaches. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Des. And so, and if there's a question from the office, all right, so I've got Diana Gutierrez.
Good morning. Congratulations and thank you so much, Des, for that presentation. Thank you for researching a very important topic. It has been a real honor to have you as part of our team this quarter, and we will certainly miss you. One of the questions that I had was, are you aware of any current efforts, either at a state or federal level, that are currently being discussed to address these inequities that you presented? And based on your research, what elements would you consider to be necessary in any effort for it to be successful in eliminating these inequities in athletics in colleges and universities?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Diana. As of right now, there are no current bills or major policy suggestions that politicians have come forward with. I do know there are certain nonprofit organizations that have made this research topic sort of the focus of their mission and their goals. So for example, when I was researching, I came across the Women's Sports Foundation. So they really focus on getting K through 12 and college and university female student athletes, getting them in, equitable access to playing sports and having access to tutoring and other extracurriculars that can support them in their sport journey. So yeah, I don't really know about any policy issues specifically, but again, there's nonprofit orgs. And then in my opinion, what I think would be just absolutely essential for us to get the ball rolling on this is suggesting a universal pay rate, because although there's inequities, a lot of inequities between students, there are also inequities between coaches. And that, is also a problem that can coincide with the gender, the wage gap, which is a larger issue in all industries in the United States, but especially for the athletic industry and for coaches of men's teams and for women's teams.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for the question, Diana, and then thank you, Des, for the presentation. And so our next student is Karen Yee, who interned with the California Department of Education Legislative Affairs Office this term.
Hello, good morning. So as we start to emerge from the COVID-19 crisis, schools are scrambling to support students' learning acceleration this summer and beyond. It turns out that one of the most effective interventions is actually tutoring. Study after study has shown that even volunteer tutors can be significantly effective. But I wondered what kinds of organizations researchers are choosing to study. What if they have only been studying the most high quality organizations? They would be overestimating the real effect of tutoring organizations nationwide. Using data on tutoring organizations provided by the National Student Support Accelerator, in addition to a list of tutoring best practices developed by the Annenberg Institute, I hypothesized that programs employing more best practices were more likely to have been studied by researchers. A one-sample t-test does not support this hypothesis, showing no significant relationship between program quality and likelihood of having been studied, as shown by Figure 1. Then I tried another measure of program quality, whether an organization was staffed by professionals or volunteers and part-time staff. This time, a chi-square test showed that volunteer organizations were significantly less likely to have been studied by researchers. Moreover, they employ significantly less best practices. This finding is consequential because what we currently know about tutor effectiveness may rely on evidence from unusually high-quality organizations that aren't representative of many organizations in operation today. While volunteer-run organizations will be vital to a cost-effective scaling of the tutoring intervention in our efforts to improve student equity, volunteer-run organizations will need to be studied more in depth in the future to gain an understanding of how we can best support these organizations to adopt evidence-based practices. Policymakers should consider state education department-sponsored trainings or certifications to ensure high-impact tutoring is available to all.
Great, thank you so much, Karen. And we've got a question from the audience here. So Ellie Gardner.
So I had the privilege of having Karen be a part of our government affairs division at CDE, and thankful to have her for the semester, and we'll be sad to lose her. So great analysis here. I guess my question is, based upon government affairs, is what kind of quality would you suggest legislation be based upon what you've learned about best practices identified really only out of those programs that are staffed by professionals rather than volunteers?
Thank you for that question, Ellie. I'm not quite sure what you meant by asking about what kinds of quality. Did you mean like best practices?
Yes, I'm sorry, best practices. What should those standards that you would suggest the legislators adopt be based on?
That's a great question. I think that having certifications or professional development trainings offered by the Department of Education based on these best practices, even though, like you said, these were best practices identified from mainly really high quality organizations, it's still possible for volunteer run organizations to adopt these practices, such as having a low student tutor ratio or having more sessions per week. It's just the case that maybe some organizations, such as college run organizations, weren't aware of these best practices. So I think just supporting the knowledge of these structures and supporting implementation is the gap here that's really existing.
Thank you so much. It's been great to have you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellie. And thank you, Karen, for the presentation today. So our next student is Giselle Gonzalez, who interned this term with the UC Student Association.
Hi, everyone. Unfortunately, food insecurity on college campuses is a common issue among students, but it is especially more so amongst first-generation students. According to the Hunger on Campus study, 56% of first-generation students experience food insecurity compared to 45% of other students nationally. This issue could impact other areas of academic life, such as graduation. So my question is, does food insecurity impact graduation rates for first-generation students on the UC campuses? With my hypothesis being that they do have an impact. So what I did was a large end study using data from the UC Undergrad Experience Survey for the food insecurity percentages from all UC campuses and comparing first-generation students to the average UC student population. And I also gathered data from the UC 2030 dashboard for the graduation rates. According to my findings, first-generation students do experience a higher rate of food insecurity compared to the average student population in the UCs, and that they also experience lower rates of graduating compared to them, overall demonstrating a relationship between higher rates of food insecurity and lower graduation rates. And one policy suggestion I have is to advocate and support the Double the Pell grant campaign to help ease the financial burden for first-generation students who are also commonly also Pell Grant recipients. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Giselle. And if there is a question from the UC Student Association, all right, so Parshan.
Hello, Giselle, and thank you so much for being a part of our organization this past quarter. Super excited about this research and the work you've done. I'm curious to see, as far as when you were looking at these food insecurity and basic needs insecurity levels, were you able to look at sort of gender breakdown as well and racial breakdown? Were there any effects that you were noticing then, or is that something that you would see as future next steps?
Well, as I was looking at the data on the dashboard, I also noticed that amongst racial groups, without fail, there was mostly African American students and Hispanic students that were the top student groups that experienced food insecurities compared to other racial groups. And so I feel like that would be interesting to kind of see for future research, to kind of see how that is seen across all the UC campuses and even in individual campus levels as well.
Great, thank you so much, Parshan, for the question. Thank you, Giselle, for the presentation today. And so our next student is Tiffany Zhang, who also interned over the UC Student Association this term.
Hello. Hello, my name is Tiffany, and I did my research on affirmative action. So even though 67% of Californians believe that diversity in public education is important, last year Proposition 16 still failed to restore affirmative action in higher education that was prohibited due to Proposition 209. We need to revisit and look into the relationship between affirmative action policy and college admission. For this research, I hypothesized that the admission rates of underrepresented minority students at the University of California has declined after implementation of Prop 209 in 1998. By drawing data from UC Info Center and comparing the admission rates by race and ethnicity immediately before and after the implementation, I found out that admission rates for underrepresented minority students in fall 1998 did drop system-wide from the previous year. But non-URM students experienced no significant changes. Specifically, the more selective campus like UC Berkeley saw an average 28 percentage point decrease in admission rates. At the same time, the average SAT score for URM showed a slight increase. All this combined suggests that it has become more difficult for URM students to enter more selective campuses than before, since higher academic achievement was stressed and expected in the admission process. We need to recognize the inequalities inherent in the admission and actively fund outreach programs, such as the sub-programs, to reduce the achievement gap and thus increase the chances of admission for the underserved students. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tiffany. And then a question from UC Student Association. So Ashra?
Hi, Tiffany. Thank you very much for your presentation and all you've done with UCSA. I wanted to ask, given this law that is in place now and that we weren't able to revert last year, how do you think institutions of higher education can navigate this policy and sort of work around it to improve relationships with communities and sort of reform their educational framework so that students of color and underrepresented populations can see themselves applying at higher rates and feeling more prepared to matriculate at the UC?
Okay, thank you for the question. And so I think it's really important that we have outreach programs to prepare high school students, California high school students to college, to prepare. So they're more academically prepared and feel more encouraged to apply to UC, even if like they cannot meet like the academic expectation, but so that's why, like, for my policy suggestion, I recommended that UC and other public higher institutions should have more funding for those outreach programs, so like more students from the underserved communities have the access, easy access to college, and more prepared for that.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Ashraf, for the question, and Tiffany for the presentation today. So our next student is Leanne Lee, and she interned this term with the UC Davis Applied Policy Center.
Good morning, and thank you so much for the introduction, Cindy. Give me a second. Did you know that average ACT scores across the nation vary up to 9 points? With the usage of standardized testing being a source of controversy, the focus of my research poster is seeing whether SAT and ACT scores are correlated with increased property tax usage in state school funding throughout the US. My hypothesis is that in states with a higher percentage of property tax funding, there will be higher SAT and ACT scores. To test my hypothesis, I used a map in the left column, which depicts the percentage of property tax used in overall school funding all across the US. And I compared that with mean SAT and ACT scores. My findings show that there's a moderate positive correlation for ACT scores and a negative weak correlation for SAT scores in respect to the property tax percentages. Though neither of my findings show a strong relationship between standardized test scores and property tax percentages, it is interesting that the trend lines are opposite. Though one explanation for this may be that the ACT is more unpopular in some states compared to others, what accounts for this difference may be worth taking into consideration in the future as the UC system prepares to create its own take on the entrance exam after ridding usage of the SAT and ACT scores this past year. It is also worth considering why states outperform others, and whether it's because schools revolve their curriculums around these exams, or it is an indirect effect due to the quality of schools in those states. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Leanne, for your presentation. And then over to questions. And so there's a question from the UC Davis Applied Policy Center. All right, Cap Ed, I think that's you, Tina, over on that.
Yes, hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Leanne, thank you for your presentation, and thanks so much for serving as an intern in the Center for Applied Policy this term. It's been great working with you. My question is around the way you came to the hypothesis, which is that there might be a correlation between the usage of property tax funds, an increased use of property taxes, and how that would in fact impact outcomes on the SAT and ACT. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I thought, wait, sorry, just to clarify, you're wondering why I thought that property tax as a source of funding would have been, why I hypothesized that that was better than state funding?
Exactly, yes.
Okay, yeah, so I thought that was the case just because I also looked at a policy brief from the Lincoln Institute, and property tax funding only fluctuated within 5%, whereas state funding fluctuated anywhere from 10 to 20% at times. And though I think my research does need to be furthered in terms of its timeline, I thought that having consistency would have been better, especially during a time like right now, just with COVID and districts needing to take on teachers that may not be as qualified. That's why I hypothesized that that would have been better.
Thank you, appreciate that.
No worries.
Great, thank you so much, Tina, for the question, and thank you, Leanne, for your presentation today. And so our next student is Alexis Sanchez, who interned this term at the California Community College Success Center.
Hi, can everyone see that okay?
We can see it, however, it's not on presentation mode just yet.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. All right, thank you so much.
Perfect, it looks great.
Thank you. In 2008, 2 out of 5 Latinx students in LAUSD attended schools in ethnically and socioeconomically segregated environments. As segregation rises in LAUSD, we must investigate what effect does school segregation have on student achievement. I hypothesize the more ethnically segregated schools have lower graduation rates. I also hypothesize that schools in neighborhoods with higher median incomes have higher graduation rates. I conducted a small N analysis on 41 schools in LAUSD, excluding continuation and magnet schools. My independent variable is the level of segregation, and my dependent variable is graduation rates. Given that over 70% of students in LAUSD are Latinx, empirically, it worked best to measure segregation by Latinx student composition using terciles. The terciles measure high, medium, and low Latinx student composition, as shown on Figure 1. I found that there was a U-shaped relationship between the terciles, which does not fully support my hypothesis. I also ran a linear regression and found that for every $1,000 increase in median neighborhood income surrounding a school, there was a 0.27 percentage point increase in graduation rates, as shown in Figure 5, which is statistically significant and supports my second hypothesis. Given these results, I recommend that the state should create policies to allocate more resources to schools in lower income neighborhoods in Los Angeles to ensure that all students have an equal chance of succeeding academically. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Alexis. And we're going to turn to a question here. So we got a question from Irma Castaneda.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Alexis, so much for your presentation and for just all the work that you contributed to our team this quarter. You were wonderful. And so my question to you is, yeah, just a little bit more on the recommendation piece. So what kind of state policies or policies would you recommend, to provide more resources to low-income neighborhoods?
Yeah, so I got this policy recommendation or inspired by the UCLA Civil Rights Project in 2008, which Gary Orfield, which is sort of an expert in this field, sort of had like two hypotheses, which is basically like to either devise policies that allocate more funds specifically to lower income schools, or to devise policies that sort of evenly distribute of resources to all schools in LAUSD. So in terms of, I chose to allocate more resources specifically to lower income schools. And to me, that would look more like, student teacher credentials, because in his report, he found that a lot of schools that are in lower income neighborhoods don't have higher teachers that don't have the proper credentials. They also have lower college going rates. So making sure that all those schools have A through G courses and the proper professional development for teachers to do so. And another thing that I would also suggest was more community investment. So students are more likely to do better if their parents are involved, if their community is involved. So I also would emphasize that in terms of the resources that they provide. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Irma, for the question. And thank you, Alexis, for your presentation today. And so we are now going to move over into the open Q&A portion of our session. And so I'm going to give Brooke just a sec here to go ahead and pause the recording.